This is the Spyderco Sharpmaker, which is a relatively well-known sharpener. There's many excellent videos on it, so I'm not going to talk very much about it. What I just want to show is a relatively recent addition, which is a set of cubic boron nitride rods that Spyderco has came out to sort of enhance the system. One of the biggest problems or complaints about the Sharpmaker was the relatively fine grits that come with the standard system, and Spyderco had out a set of diamond rods before which were essentially proposed to solve the issue of, well, what happens if you get a knife and it doesn't have either a 15-degree or 20-degree edge bevel and you try to sharpen it. It takes quite some time with the medium rods to get the edge to where it's even going to start sharpening, and you're otherwise just planing down the edge. So Spyderco put out a set of diamond rods, and now they have a set of cubic boron nitride rods. These are not solid cubic boron nitride, they're electroplated, which means there is a top coating of cubic boron nitride on the rod. Eventually that will wear out and the rods would need to be replated, but unless you're relatively connected in the industry, you're probably just going to buy a new set of rods. However, cubic boron nitride is extremely hard. It's the second hardness material, only comparable to essentially diamond or some other relatively interesting material at some point, depending on what variation of material you're actually talking about. They all start to become competitive in terms of hardness with each other. So anyway, it's very hard. It's much harder than any ceramic. It's much harder than the carbides that are found in knives. It's harder than, of course, the Spyderco sharpening stones. Very hard. The issue when you're using them is to not damage them. It's to not tear the abrasive out, essentially, of the actual coating itself. So you want to use very low force, and in general I'd always recommend that you use a mister to wet these rods or wet any abrasive, because you do not want to throw metal dust up in the air and be breathing it in. And lubricant, I normally just use water, will also again help you in focusing on keeping the force down so you don't damage the actual rods. Spyderco rate these at 400 mesh to micron. That would be around 40 microns. I checked them under magnification and they do look to be around 40 microns, which is relatively coarse. I did some very basic experiments with these, and the link is in the description. You can sort of read about that. Essentially, you can get a knife sharp with them, though I don't really recommend doing it until you want a bit of a challenge, because it can be a bit difficult. Again, these are very coarse, it's a coated product, so I'd mainly recommend it for shaping only, to make that first bevel and then sharpen it on the rods as you normally would. The issue that you're going to have, though, is that there's a really big grit jump between these at around 40 micron to around these, which are much finer. And I'll also put a link in the description to some work I did on these to rate the micron of these, and they're much finer than this. So I actually created a bevel with these, just a micro bevel, about 1/10 of a millimeter wide. And even then it took around 30 passes with the medium ceramics to take that, again, 1/10 of a millimeter wide bevel from this finish to that. Most edge bevels on knives are going to be much bigger than 1/10 of a millimeter, so it will take you more passes. To resolve that issue, I would recommend that you don't sharpen with these and the final bevels on the same angle. Sharpen at a smaller angle with these and then micro bevel. Now, the solution to that is very simple. Here's a $2 Canadian coin. Put that under the Spyderco Sharpmaker and it tilts it at an angle of around 1/2 degree. That means that this one is now moving back, so it's 1/2 degree bigger. It's 15 degrees per side. This one is moving ahead, so the angle is going to be lower, so it's going to be at 14.5 degrees per side. So what I would do is I'd put the coin basically under this side, and I'd then sharpen this at 14.5 degrees per side. I'd then move the coin to the other side, and it would now tilt the Sharpmaker this way, and I'd sharpen on this and get that 14.5 degrees per side. Then I'd take the coin out and sharpen as normal on these, and just put that final 15 degree bevel on it. Now, even though this is much easier to hold a constant angle going up and down than normal freehand sharpening. Unless you're relatively experienced with it, you could get some angle slop. So if you're relatively experienced, this little coin and about a half a degree is pretty much going to be all that you need. However, if you've just started using it, you're not that experienced, you might want to put a bigger wedge underneath it. Something like this, like a little notepad. And that'll force you up. Like that. And now you've got a bigger degree. You can see, of course, now that if you go on the center line, this one has a smaller angle, and then again this one has a larger angle. And you can even make up some little wedges using some basic trigonometry. It's just the height of the wedge and the length of the Sharpmaker, and that tells you the angle increase that you're actually using. And there's a number of people who've actually done these calculations. You can go look it up on the internet, and they actually show you, if you want a certain degree, this is how high your wedge should be. So, I've only used these a little bit so far. A couple of interesting questions that are going to come out of them is, what exactly is the speed of cut of these relative to the medium rods? I've done a couple of comparisons of that, but I'd want to do more before I would put a number on it. But as of right now, I'm just going to say that it's very large. It's not like 2 to 1, it's much greater than that in terms of cutting speed. And that's sort of what you would expect. Because in general, if abrasives are similar in nature, you'd expect cutting speed to be similar to the micron ratio. It's not going to be exactly the micron ratio, because in general on coarse abrasive you very rarely get the full micron cut depth. But that's a decent first starting approximation. It's usually an over approximation. The other thing, of course, is going to be long time maintenance, storability, how long these actually last, how much sharpenings can you actually do on them is going to be an interesting question to look at. First look again at these rods. They're going to be shipping relatively quickly, and just again from first glance, haven't done a lot of work with it. If you're the type of person that really likes to use a Sharpmaker as an all-inclusive tool, you don't like to combine it with bench stones to do your initial shaping, it looks like these are going to be relatively an interesting addition. But again, I don't know things like about durability and stuff yet. Hasn't done very much with them. Now, as a very basic sort of demonstration of the cutting speed, this is standard Mora, one of my most well-used Moras. This is Bester 700 Waterstone. Sort of semi-hard Waterstone, much harder than the Kings, but not up there with your really hard sharpening stones. So I've got a relatively obvious flat now on this edge, and I can see it clearly reflecting light. So all I'm going to do now essentially is take this reflection of light off. For me personally, once this reflection of light is off, I know that the edge is less than 20 microns thick. That means I'm right at the point now where I can finish it. I don't like going right to a burr, because then I've over sharpened it, and now I'm into, I don't want to bring this to a full burr. I don't want to bring it to an apex with these stones, because it's much too coarse and I wouldn't leave it for this. This is a woodworking knife. So essentially I'm going to work it on these stones until this essentially light that I can see, this edge is harmless now, right, because I just cut it off. So bring this down to where I can't see this light reflecting off it, and then I know it's right in the condition to finish at whatever angle or whatever grit I wanted to finish it at. And this won't take very long at all, because again these are relatively coarse. Again, use very light, and in general I'd recommend using water. I'm using them dry now. And again, these cut fast, so I just want to keep an eye on it. Now the nice thing about putting the line on it is that you can sort of see where the edge is dull. So I concentrated up around this area because the reflected line of light was still relatively heavy there. Okay, now there's no light reflecting from the edge. And that's all it took. It's around 15 passes per side. So they do cut relatively aggressively. Now, if you want to actually try to sharpen on these, this is where I'd really recommend you use water, because again, they're hyper aggressive and you sort of want to slow that down. But if you do want to try to sharpen, because the stones are so aggressive, you have to alternate between both sides and you have to use ultra light force. For me, the limit of force that I can actually use and have any control is around 5 grams. Less than 5 grams, I can't even control where the knife is that's on it, but that's basically dependent on you. So you want to go just as light, and you can see I'm barely making contact. And I'm alternating now because now I am actually forming an apex on these. Again, which I wouldn't recommend you do unless of course you want super coarse aggressive edges. Now I didn't form a heavy burr, but there's always going to be one on the edge. Doesn't matter what you do. Unless you stop it absolutely instantaneously perfectly the moment that you reach it, you're going to over sharpen to some degree. So now what I'm going to do is tilt the knife this way to increase the edge angle, try to minimize that burr, and I'm going to go as light as I possibly can with very little travel. Same thing here. And now I'll go back again. And you can see I'm barely holding onto the knife at all. It's not even the full weight of the knife because I'm essentially just trying to control the knife on the stones because I want to minimize the force, because again these are very aggressive, and in general use a mister, keep these wet. So that looks relatively decent. And what you'll get is an extremely aggressive edge that, I mean, you can easily shave with it, but it's hyper aggressive because the teeth are very coarse. So at the same time that it's actually shaving, it's going to be sawing into your skin. But it is a nice edge if you want to cut ropes and stuff like that, and of course it'll easily work on papers, on slices. But it's much easier to do if you wet it down.